The city of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine always had a little more war history than the other nearby towns. Without exaggeration, the battles of various intensities raged around it for 10 years. Located in the heart of Donetsk Region, to the northwest of Donetsk itself, it became a frontline city not in 2022 or 2023 with a full-scale invasion, but in 2014, when Russia just started its proxy war against Ukraine, often called War in Donbas. Despite the 4-month-long occupation in 2014, subsequent liberation by the Ukrainian Armed Forces and numerous attacks in 2017, Avdiivka remained under firm Ukrainian control, becoming an important outpost just on the outskirts of occupied Donetsk. All this forced Ukrainians to fortify the town, turning its web of streets with residential houses, high-rise buildings, and the large Avdiivka coke and chemical plant into a single stronghold by the beginning of 2022. The key villages nearby were also reinforced, but due to lack of industrial facilities and concrete buildings, holding defense there was much harder. Nevertheless, in the first half of the year of full-scale invasion, the front line near Avdiivka was regarded as remarkably stable and favorable for defenders. Despite numerous attacks, Russians have managed to advance from the 2014 demarcation line only to the north of the city, failing to gain significant territory elsewhere. To avoid overstretching the video, today we will focus on the main Russian assault on Avdiivka that started in October 2023. By that time, the earlier mentioned challenges with the defense of nearby villages precipitated into Ukrainians losing Opytne, Pisky and Vodyane to the south, as well as Kruta Balka, Kamyanka, Vesele and Krasnohorivka to the north. Even though it was a modest success for the Russians, considering they took a year and a half to get that far, it created two alarming pincers around the city. Moreover, Russians not only threaten Ukrainian logistics right off the bat, but also can conveniently conceal, supply and command their own forces right from the large city of Donetsk. Leveraging this enormous logistical advantage, as of October, Russians choose Avdiivka as their new main axis of advance, concentrating at least 40,000 troops of Grouping of Forces Center in the area. Ukrainian task will be to counter that with somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 strong operational strategic Grouping of Forces Tavria concentrated inside and on the flanks of the salient. This statement that Avdiivka is the most fortified town in Ukraine was also not completely true as of October 2023. It's a common misconception that the city was heavily bombed by Russian aviation only during the main assault. In reality, the airstrikes started degrading Ukrainian fortifications as early as February 2023, so together with artillery, they rendered ineffective a big fraction of Ukrainian defensive positions and forced almost the entire population of 30,000 people to flee. Despite this, the Ukrainian 110th Mechanized Brigade remains in the city in full force. Formed in March 2022, it was immediately deployed to Avdiivka and held it without major rotations for 1.5 years, showing incredible combat effectiveness for a newly formed unit. As of October 2023, it's supported by the 5th Detachment of National Guard Omega Unit, 6th, 26th and 407th Separate Rifle Battalions, 3rd Separate Special Purpose Regiment, 36th Marine Brigade with attached to it 503rd Separate Marine Battalion, and 53rd Mechanized Brigade. Ukrainian Special Police Unit and Border Guard Special Detachments also defend the streets of the city. Outside of the northern pincer, Ukrainians concentrate the 116th, 129th Territorial Defense, Separate Presidential, 55th and 43rd Artillery Brigades, with the support of the 52nd Separate Rifle Battalion. To the south, the 56th and 59th Mechanized Brigades with the 9th and 11th Motor Rifle Battalions and the Polish Volunteer Corps hold the ground. The proximity of the large Donetsk urban area allows Russians to concentrate and supply much more numerous forces that mostly consist of former DPR units of the 1st Army Corps integrated in the Russian military. These are 110th Motor Rifle Brigade, 10th Tank, 80th Sparta, 13th Somalia, 287th Separate Rifle Battalions, 14th Kalmius Artillery Brigade, 15th Separate Battalion Petnashka, 21st, 114th Motor Rifle Brigades, supported by the 207th, 277th UGRA Volunteer and 6th Marine Battalions. All these are reinforced by 9 territorial defense regiments composed of mobilized men, which are supposed to be an expendable element, the same as replenished with convicts Storm Z and Storm V. As we mentioned in our video about the battle for Bakhmut, Despite the sharp conflict between the Russian Ministry of Defense and PMC Wagner, Russian generals were impressed with Prigozhin's ability to make incremental tactical gains regardless of losses. Now it will be the turn of Andrei Mordvichov, commander of the grouping of forces center, to send waves of men on Ukrainian fortifications if the initial plan goes wrong. This time, however, expendable units were made not only out of convicts, but also mobilized regular citizens. On October 10th, Russians begin their massive mechanized assault on the flanks, try to swiftly cut through Ukrainian defenses near Krasnohorivka and Vodyane to link in the area of Berdych and Avdiivka. Such a maneuver makes sense, as directly storming Avdiivka, even after months of heavy bombardments, can cost Russians tens of thousands of casualties. Following the envelopment plan, they surge forward on hundreds of BMPs, PTRs and tanks arranged in long columns. With infantry packed both inside and on top of the vehicles, Russians likely count on the element of surprise and weak Ukrainian resistance. The mistake that will cost them hundreds of soldiers and dozens of armored vehicles right on the first day of the assault. On the northern pincer, the Ukrainian artillery and drones start striking Russian columns moving to Stepove right when the vehicles leave Krasnohorivka. The attacks in this direction mostly fail due to Ukrainians controlling the waste heap, one of the key high grounds in the area that gives excellent opportunities to strike anyone brave enough to cross the open fields below. Russians also know that, so the attack towards Stepove happens simultaneously with the assault of dozens of vehicles of the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade in the direction of waste heap. However, the Ukrainian recon drones quickly locate the huge columns and artillery immediately opens fire. The Russian vehicles, stuck in a tight formations or simply one large traffic jam, suddenly find themselves under the rain of regular and cluster munitions. In the space of just 30 minutes, 11 armored vehicles are lost, including one 70-year-old BTR-50 overturned by explosion wave. Russians hastily retreat, leaving dozens of killed on the road that leads to the waste heap. Consequently, the attacks towards Stepove are also repelled on that day. However, Russian commanders do not plan to change the tactic. They are quite aware of how limited Ukrainian artillery stockpiles and reserves currently are, so they are willing to sacrifice a few more mechanized columns to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Near Vodyane, the mechanized assault of October 10th is followed even faster. There, Russians made a pontoon bridge across a destroyed road right next to the pond. However, once the large column is assembled, the very first vehicle, the remote deminer Ur-77, falls off the pontoon bridge, compromising the safety of a key crossing. This sets a tone for further attack, so Russians foiled an attempt to advance here. This form of Ukrainian FPV drones soon attacks vehicles on the streets of Vodyane, finalizing the decision to abort the mission. On October 10th, auxiliary attacks are also launched towards Pervomaiske and from Spartak to no avail. Overall, the Russians revealed their plan of making a large encirclement of Avdiivka, destroying the defenders once and for all. However, the whole operation got off to a confused start. Russians lost the element of surprise and took most of their losses before even reaching close to the Ukrainian positions, just like near Vuhledar, about which we made a separate video. In cases where they have managed to get to positions or simply lost the vehicle during the attack, infantry resorts to quite disorganized maneuvers, which in turn result in high casualties. Attacks take a heaviest toll on the multiple 4-digit territorial defense units, many of which already changed the whole staff a few times. Despite this, the Battle of Avdiivka will prove to be one of the rare operations where in the course of the engagement conditions for attackers do not get worse, but improve with every month due to reasons we will discuss later. On the next day, Russians still attack in columns on both flanks, ramping up activity near Vodyane, where losses continue to mount due to the high activity of FPV drones and dense mining of the key roads. By October 12th, they further reinforced the southern flank with the 1st Slovyansk and 9th Motor Rifle Brigades, as well as the 87th and 111th Motor Rifle Regiments. Fresh forces by the 13th allow Russians to make progress on the very tips of the pincers. The arrival of the 57th Motor Rifle and 10th Tank Regiments in the area of Spartak further deteriorates the situation for defenders, as Ukrainians reinforce positions only with a single battalion of the 63rd Mechanized Brigade. Still, it looks like Russian forces still do not reach the critical mass to crush the defense in one decisive blow, even though Avdiivka and Ukrainian troops there are under daily artillery and air strikes. Meanwhile, the attacks in long columns are repeated as Russians use Ur-77s to clear the narrow paths through minefields. These, however, often become a number one targets for FPV drones that swarm the battlefield. Ukrainians first came up with the idea of using them against armored vehicles and even infantry during the 2023 summer counteroffensive. The experiment was so successful that by October, FPV drones became one of the primary mid-range anti-armor weapons due to low cost, fast and simple production cycle, and few effective countermeasures. Worth mentioning that FPVs cannot fully substitute the artillery due to limited flight distance, the possibility of jamming, and the relatively small warheads. Therefore, a variety of Ukrainian howitzers, ATGMs, and landmines are also the reasons why massive mechanized assaults fail so catastrophically. After initial breakthrough attempts, Russians regroup and strike with a huge number of armored vehicles again, around October 19th. The same, if not greater, number of BMPs, BTRs and tanks surge forward again, as Russian command still counts on the idea of quick encirclement. The assault on the flanks also happens while Russians intensify attacks on the whole city perimeter. For example, a huge number of skirmishes happen in the area of Tsarska Okhota, a former restaurant complex that was extensively fortified and is currently being under attacks of 1st Slovyansk Motor Rifle Brigade. The Russian 9th Motor Rifle simultaneously pushes towards Netailove. The 1454th Motor Rifle Regiment of Territorial Defense and the 21st Motorized Rifle Brigade strike from Kamyanka. Petnashka and Yugra volunteer battalions attempt to advance straight to the N20 highway. However, against all the odds, Ukrainians repulse the greatest assault on Avdiivka so far, inflicting heavy losses on the adversary, mostly because Russians lack the flexibility to adjust the tactic. For example, on October 19th, one Russian column attacks in the direction of Stepove, following the same path as previous mechanized assaults. However, it has only 2 tanks in the head of the column, and the rest are 11 packed with infantry but thinly armored BTR 82As, the least appropriate vehicles for such an assault. Before even getting close to the tree line, one of the BTRs is on fire after either an artillery shell, drone, or ATGM hit. Russians cannot spread or move faster because BTRs have to stay behind tanks with mine plows since they are navigating a narrow corridor in the minefield. The remains of the destroyed vehicles around are a good reminder of that. Taking heavy fire from Ukrainians in the tree line, tanks try to leave the kill zone, making a U-turn quite far away from the adversary positions. At this point, 7 BTRs are still too far away to drop the infantry, so as few vehicles are damaged, soldiers hurry to abandon them and retreat back by foot. 2 BTRs attempt to turn around, but one of them is hit by an artillery shell. Another BTR that was first on fire finally comes to a halt as well. Eventually, only in this attack, Russians lost 6 BTR 82As and retreated without making the slightest progress. The fields and tree lines between Krasnohorivka and Stepove quickly beat the area of Vuhledar by a number of so-called cemeteries of armored vehicles, which have over a dozen of pieces each. Moreover, Russians repeatedly tried to push through the exact same minefields and corridors on which Ukrainians zeroed their artillery. Another video from the same field shows how another huge Russian column tries to push through the so-called cemetery, which already has at least 5 hulls of destroyed Russian vehicles. The tank that reaches the intersection first gets lucky, same as BTR behind, as they carefully bypass destroyed equipment and move forward. Another BTR, however, is blown up by a landmine after slightly diverting from the safe path. The tank behind pushes on, however, it also drifts off the course, and another landmine disables it. The other BTRs start piling up behind the immobilized vehicles, and likely evaluate their chances of getting through this mined area. Suddenly, one of the BTRs goes in full steam ahead, ramming the motionless vehicle in front. Balls don't go far away, because they trigger another landmine that tears apart both vehicles. At the same time, Lucky Tank and BTR continue their advance towards adversary positions. However, as the movement of the column was carefully recorded by Ukrainian drone all this time, the punishment is on its way. In a matter of minutes, the tank is hit by a Ukrainian FPV drone in the rear part of the turret. The immediate detonation of munitions inside turns it into a huge torch, which BTR has to swiftly bypass. The vehicle even survives something that looks like an unlucky FPV drone strike. but in a few seconds the landmine explosion below tears it apart. The catastrophic secondary detonation of what was likely a second mine seals the fate of the BTR and the fate of the whole attack. These are only a few typical examples of how Russians conducted mechanized assaults through open fields between Krasnohorivka and Stepove. However, it would be incorrect to assume that Ukrainians countered them easily. In this specific direction, the attacks shown were mostly repelled by Omega and the 3rd Special Purpose Regiment, which are special operation forces. Ukrainians have to rely on these highly specialized, for completely different missions units, along with regular forces, which indicates a sharp shortage of men. However, just in time, the Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade arrives at positions near Stepove from the southern front to assist in repelling massive mechanized assaults. Unlike all other brigades in the area, it operates a significant number of Western equipment, first and foremost M2 Bradleys and Leopard 2s. Particularly the American-made infantry fighting vehicles distinguish themselves as an ideal combination of firepower and protection, even against Russian FPV drones. These started appearing on the battlefield in mass after Ukrainians showed the potential of this new weapon in the summer. Worth mentioning, however, that the 47th Brigade is quite exhausted after almost a half of year of grinding battles near Robotine. Nevertheless, the defenders of Avdiivka currently need and welcome any support. Even though Ukrainians inflicted sharp checks on 2 major waves of Russian mechanized assaults, they eventually start falling back. This way, by October 23rd, Russians advanced to the railroad, capturing notorious fields near Krasnohorivka, covered in burned-down metal hulls. The heavy battles also raged for Waste Heap, for the capture of which Russians additionally deployed the whole 21st Motor Rifle Brigade, as the obliterated 114th is kept in battle only by constant replenishments pulled from territorial defense regiments. Here, mechanized forces are useless, as only infantry can go up the steep hill. The combat is brutal, especially due to Ukrainians actively using FPV drones, while Russians demolish their high ground positions with artillery, but attackers once again prevail, taking the Waste Heap and raising their flag on top on October 28th. For now, they are unable to utilize the high ground with maximum effectiveness. This is due to the continuing pressure of Ukrainian FPVs that take out infantry that has to often move in the open. Even the Russian flag that was installed on the Waste Heap is eventually demolished in a similar manner. During the 2023 summer counteroffensive, Ukrainians formed a number of new drone units in every brigade, and separate ones, 2 of which, Shadow and Flying Skull, arrive at the Avdiivka front line. By October 28th, around Stepove, Ukrainians also concentrate the 1st Tank and 31st Mechanized Brigades to counter further attempts to cross the railroad, which now acts as a new defensive line. Attackers act akin, keeping the worn-down 114th Brigade in the spearhead of the attack, but backing it up with 277th Battalion and reinforcing the whole direction with a fresh 15th Motor Rifle Brigade. Moreover, the concept of ammunition hunger, which started being an extremely relevant problem in the Russian military during the battle for Bakhmut, is completely mitigated by recent supplies of reportedly 500,000 artillery shells from North Korea. In addition to that, Russian aviation equipped with more and more abundant OMPK glide bombs becomes one of the primary tools for destroying Ukrainian fortifications. Not as accurate as American JDAM's ERs, the upgrade kits for Russian regular bombs still allow aviation to drop munitions up to 60 kilometers away from the target, greatly enhancing the survivability of an aircraft. As usual, the lack of precision is mitigated by sheer numbers of munitions, as Russians use up to 60 glide bombs on Avdiivka alone, daily, at the peak of the bombing campaign. At the same time, the Ukrainians are gradually cut out from supplies, the most important of which, 155mm shells, swiftly become more and more scarce. The same is true for surface-to-air missiles. All is due to the Vital Aid bill being stuck in the US Congress and used as a bargaining tool in endless negotiations. For now, defenders possess the minimum needed number of shells, but with every day of fighting, the stockpiles gradually erode. Meanwhile, on the southern flank, the situation is mostly static. The series of ponds, between which a number of narrow roads exist, doesn't facilitate the fast mechanized breakthrough by Russians, so Ukrainians even removed the 36th Marine Brigade and attached to it separate battalion, giving a full control over the southern flank to the 53rd Mechanized Brigade. There, the area is saturated with Ukrainian FPV drones, which continue catching stray vehicles on the streets of devastated towns, so that Russians cannot quickly accumulate forces for the assault. The attacks still happen, but usually involve only a few vehicles, as well as motorcycles, which amid losses become more and more common means of transportation for Russian assault groups. The least possible losses we are talking about are 109 visually confirmed destructions of armored vehicles, only around Avdiivka, and only between October 10th and 20th. For the same time period, Ukrainians lost only 3 vehicles. By November 1st, Russians only slightly expand the area of control near Vodyane. The window of opportunity for quick and massive mechanized assault is already closed, as constant rains create deep mud, which further hampers the Russian efforts to use mechanized columns. Nevertheless, the infantry battles on the northern flank rage for every inch of the railroad. Ukrainians deploy the Russian Volunteer Corps to defend the area together with the 47th and 31st Mechanized Brigades. The railroad is quickly turned into a kill zone, but 2 dense tree lines surrounding it provide a good cover for attackers. The Russians, who used up most of their armored vehicles reserved for the offensive and face a constant threat of FPV drones, are forced to walk to the railroad by foot before entering the battle. There, the lucky ones get across the tracks but immediately face Ukrainian Bradleys, drones and artillery. Almost daily, the Russian attacks are foiled as Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles patrol the area and obliterate with autocannons multiple assault groups. Russians try to use their own artillery and drones to specifically hunt down American-made IFVs. As by accounts of Russians themselves, even one M2 Bradley can be a formidable obstacle. Destruction and immobilization of a few Western vehicles may seem negligible, but the problem is that only one Ukrainian brigade operates a significant number of them. By a significant number, we really mean roughly 100 M2s, less than what Russians lost in the first 10 days of their assaults on Avdiivka. Moreover, due to delayed US aid bill, Ukrainians cannot expect the losses to be replaced anytime soon. The Russian command mitigates a stalemate on the northern flank in the usual fashion, sending more men, and by November 7th, the railroad is crossed in the area of Stepove. On the next day, Russians further push Ukrainians back from the tree lines, and by the 11th, expand the wedge to the north. At this point, they start actively infiltrating the obliterated village of Stepove in small groups. The tree line near the railroad, where Russians accumulate before the attacks, resembles a real graveyard and is mostly destroyed at this point. However, the Russian command continues to maintain pressure on Ukrainians by sending more and more men every day. Due to high losses, the battle again enters a brief stalemate. By November 14th, Russians have no significant progress there, but intensify attacks on the southern flank and in the city itself. Near Vodyane, out of desperation, Russians try to use MTLBs loaded with explosives to destroy Ukrainian positions in tree lines. Apparently, such experiments do not go well, as most of the vehicles are destroyed by landmines or drones before reaching their destination. Most of the assaults, however, happen not here, but in the industrial area called Promka, where brutal urban combat rages for each building. The advance there, as everywhere on the front line, is no longer mechanized due to past losses. Instead, Russians resort to mostly using small infantry groups, just like Wagner, to slowly but gradually grind forward. They also try to expand the northern pincer by successfully attacking the positions of the worn-down 116th Territorial Defense Brigade to the north. The more experienced 47th Mechanized Brigade launches a counterattack near Stepove to divert the Russian efforts and prevent the expansion of the wedge. Eventually, in heavy combat, they push the adversary in the area of railroad tree line, which forces Russians to divert reserves from the north. This way, the 116th gets precious time and uses it to regroup and establish new positions. On November 18th, Russians further advance in Promka, while reaching certain progress near railroad. On the next day, they expand the area of control near Vesele and take a foothold in the eastern part of Stepove. At this point, the situation on the northern flank becomes quite alarming. Ukrainian forces, worn down and deprived of ammunition, slowly fall back, while Russians, despite losses and the initial failure of the mechanized assault plan, grind forward, paying an enormous price for each meter. Former DPR's brigades changed almost their whole staff, but the constant flow of newly mobilized men and numerous smaller regiments, ready to temporarily replace the main assault force, keep the 114th, 21st and 15th brigades in the fight. Moreover, Russians gather sizable reserves out of the 6th, 80th and 239th Tank Regiments of the 90th Tank Division and 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, which soon will enter the battle. It's worth mentioning that Russian glide bombs, artillery and helicopters also strike Ukrainian positions here, in the open fields, not only inside the city, where soldiers can find at least some cover. Even though Russian progress since October 10th is modest, they actually do not have to advance that far. Avdiivka is mostly supplied through two key roads, with the only paved one going through the area of the coke and chemical plant, just 3 kilometers from the captured waste heap. The other one lies less than 2 kilometers from adversary positions on the southern flank. On November 20th, Russians still inertially advanced to the north of Krasnohorivka, across another railroad strand, but this is likely the area which the Ukrainian 116th Territorial Defense Brigade left while taking stronger positions. Having the benefit of hindsight, we can see that from the fact that Russians will not be able to advance further to the north till the end of the battle. The redeployment of the 31st Mechanized Brigade to strengthen this sector was another crucial decision that shaped the front line here. Understanding that establishing full control over Stepove will likely take months, if nothing changes, Russians again start pushing inside the city with the combined force of the 55th Mountain Motor Rifle and Pyatnashka brigades in what was named by Ukrainian command a third wave of attack. At the same time, facing a huge number of drones, Russians turned to World War I tactic of tunnel warfare. They make tunnels under no man's land and Ukrainian fortifications, plant explosives and blow them up digging the exit in the middle of devastated position. After that, infantry attacks through the tunnel, exploiting the gap. Such a tactic allows Russians to advance in the area of the residential building near Promka, but as Ukrainians retreat to new fortified positions every time, it's likely too labor-intensive to sustain on a large scale. Thus, most of the attacks on defenders' positions were still conducted with small infantry groups and with the support of armored vehicles. By the end of the month, little changes as Russians somewhat consolidate their positions across the railroad and in Promka, but struggle to gain significant ground, even after Ukrainian fortifications are turned into dust by hundreds of glide bombs. After almost 2 months of brutal assaults with horrendous losses, it becomes obvious that all Russians can rely on is Wildland support from the key Ukrainian allies. As December begins, Ukrainians start voicing new concerns about the ammunition levels. The most critical type, 155mm shells, which were mostly provided by the US, are not shipped in needed quantities. European countries do what they can, with Germany being the main donor trying to cover the deficit, but they simply cannot catch up with the Ukrainian rate of fire. On the ground, it means that for every Ukrainian shell, Russians fire 9 of their own. Currently, they also hold 5-to-1 advantage in the number of men and reach localized air superiority due to heavy use of OMPK glide bombs. In these conditions, Ukrainians lose a few positions near the railroad by December 2nd, but continue to resist doggedly on the whole front line. At this point, the command of the defenders decides to further reinforce Avdiivka with extra troops. The 45th Separate Rifle, Siberia and 425th Skala battalions arrive on the northern flank by December 2nd. On the next day, the 23rd Mechanized Brigade appears in the area of Stepove. Finally, on December 4th, the 116th Mechanized, 8th Special Purpose Regiment and the 1st Detachment of Omega National Guard Unit shore up the flanks of Avdiivka. On that day, Russians also advance towards the local pumping station. By December 8th, they expand their control further, but still are far from driving a wedge between the city and Avdiivka coke and chemical plant. However, at this point, both the Ukrainian ammunition shortage as well as the dense fog that blankets the area and reduces the effectiveness of drones start having a detrimental effect on the ability of Ukrainians to hold their positions. On December 11th, the pumping station is taken by Russians. On the next day, the breakthrough happens both from Promka area and across the railroad to the north of Stepove. The Russians start actively moving their armored vehicles across the railroad as they firmly hold the area behind it, even under constant strikes of FPV drones. The fact that the ground is no longer muddy but frozen is another reason why mechanized assaults are renewed to some extent. However, M2 Bradleys of the 47th Brigade again show themselves as formidable weapon systems, shredding multiple Russian vehicles with their autocannons. On December 17th, Russians expand the area of control near Vodyane with the forces of newly arrived 35th Motor Rifle Brigade and further advance inside Avdiivka. The progress on the southern flank was possible as Ukrainians there simply ran out of drones, mortar shells and grenades, right when Russians decided to spearhead toward them under the cover of the fog. Fortunately for Ukrainians, the tank and BMP were stopped by landmines, and the infantry retreated, but the opportunity to finish them off was lost. By December 22nd, Russians attempt to strike towards Novokalinova, but advance only insignificantly. Still, the Russian command shifts focus from the flanks to the city itself, even though to the south and north they still have modest progress, advancing from Vodyane on December 28th and to the north of Stepove on December 31st. The new year begins with a relative pause, at least with regard to the frontline changes. The only places where Russians advance are the areas of the southern pincer at pumping station. However, a static front line does not mean the absence of heavy fighting. In Stepove, Ukrainians and Russians clash in brutal close-quarters combat, with both sides deploying more and more infantry, drones and armored vehicles into the area. One of the videos captured with drone on January 11th shows a famous encounter of the Ukrainian Bradleys of the 47th Brigade with the most modern Russian tank, T-90M. The tank is positioned on one of the streets and is hit by something, likely an FPV drone. At the same time, the Bradley drives perpendicularly and notices the Russian tank only when it's less than 100 meters away. After a brief stop and target identification, Bradley boldly carries on, opening fire with an autocannon and scoring multiple hits in the frontal armor and turret of the tank. T-90M makes a shot while reversing but misses. Bradley continues movement and accurate autocannon fire, which T-90M withstands quite well for now, making another bad shot almost at point-blank range. Ukrainian vehicle briefly breaks the contact, but after increasing the distance, continues to occasionally fire at T-90, making sure it does not feel safe enough to turn around and escape. The tank also returns fire once again but misses. In a couple of minutes, another Bradley arrives at the scene, while the Russian tank tries to hide behind the smoke screen. As the first Bradley leaves, the second one rapidly approaches the intersection. It's also likely that the drone operator and both Bradley crews exchange information, so knowing that T-90M is likely disoriented after a previous encounter, second Bradley presses on, even though its autocannon is way inferior to the tank gun, one shell from which can easily destroy the American-made IFV. Bradley moves forward and backward on the street right in front of the T-90, constantly laying fire on the tank. One of the dozens of hits even triggers a smoke screen, while the tank crew enters panic mode and drives randomly around the battlefield. Eventually, the Ukrainian vehicle leaves, as the tank's turret is damaged to the extent that it rotates uncontrollably. The tank reverses with the turret spinning until it finally hits a tree. Eventually, all three crew members escape, and the damaged T-90M is finished off by the drone. This video not only shows how intense the close-quarters combat for Stepove is, but also emphasizes the importance of communication on the battlefield, as T-90M's undoubtedly superior firepower and armor were essentially mitigated by combined attacks of infantry fighting vehicles and FPVs under the careful supervision of reconnaissance drone. Meanwhile, the 74th and 132nd Motor Rifle Brigades, Volunteer Brigade Española, and 60th Veterane Assault Brigade are deployed to the east of Avdiivka. Reinforced with Bars 11 Kubani unit, these are gathered to finally drive a significant wedge in city defenses, as the encirclement plan takes too long. However, they have another ace down their sleeve. For almost a month, Russian forces were secretly clearing the old sewer pipe that leads directly to Tsarska Ochota. This restaurant complex is the center and the key to the network of fortified positions across southern Avdiivka, and its fall could compromise the further defense of the city. All head-on attacks on Ukrainian troops into Tsarska Ochota failed, so Russians came up with a quite creative way to bypass fortifications. On January 17th, around 150 best soldiers of the 60th Brigade are sent down the pipe. With a diameter of 1 meter and 40 centimeters, as well as length of almost 4 kilometers, the pipe leads directly to the Tsarska Ochota, so soldiers are expected to launch a surprising assault on Ukrainians after digging themselves out. Russian troops immediately face problems, as they have to crawl for 12 hours in a cold pipe, some section of which had almost no air or were half filled by water. Any artillery strikes above stun the soldiers, while also preventing the Ukrainians from detecting the sounds from below. On the same day, the first batch of soldiers reaches Tsarska Ochota, and after digging the exit, enter the combat with surprised Ukrainian troops. However, as it quickly becomes clear that the 5th Company of the 2nd Mechanized Battalion of the 110th Mechanized Brigade is not going to retreat easily, Russians start pouring more and more people into the pipe as fast as they can. This further overcrowds the tunnel and lowers oxygen levels. As the first losses mount, the pipe also becomes a place to transport wounded, so it quickly fills not only with exhausted troops, but also with bodies of dead and injured. Some Russian soldiers start to lose consciousness, others throw away equipment to reach their destination faster, while a few take their lives right among their comrades to end the misery. Nevertheless, the bulk of forces follows the order and slowly but steadily pours to the other side. Ukrainians are quickly surrounded, but continue relentless resistance as the 5th Company is determined to fight to the death for the strategic position. The unit suffers heavy casualties, losing around 40 men during organizing 5 days. On January 22nd, the combined force of the 1st Mechanized Battalion of the 110th Brigade, 425th Skala Battalion, a tank of the 116th Mechanized Brigade, and Bradley of the 47th conduct flanking attack, pushing Russians away from the Tsarska Ochota and relieving friendly forces. Their adversary, however, already took a foothold in the residential buildings to the north and continues to pour out of the sewage pipe, so the fighting here becomes as brutal as in Stepová. Seeing how Ukrainian reserves were diverted to the critical situation to the southeast, Russians amass forces and intensify attacks near Vasile. For the first time, they start using famous golf cars, acquired from China in quantities close to 1,500 vehicles, officially known as Desert Cross 1003. Being simple all-terrain vehicles, these lack mobility and practically any armor, but Russian command is desperate enough to throw their infantry on anything that can move into attack. This is because the second anniversary of the special military operation, as well as the Russian presidential elections, are coming up soon, and Avdiivka must be taken by these dates. Many sources close to the Russian military command will later uncover the reluctance of local commanders to rush the operation to meet political goals. Once the plan with fast mechanized breakthrough failed, Russians decided to turn Avdiivka into a second Bakhmut, gradually pushing through the flanks with huge quantities of expendable infantry, while Ukrainian command will be wavering to pull forces out or continue the defense. Instead, the political leadership demanded to put all their efforts into one strike that would achieve a quick victory. By February 1st, Russians execute the order, pushing back the outnumbered and outgunned Ukrainians near Vasile as defenses start crumbling on the whole front line. This happens first and foremost due to sharp deficit of artillery munitions, shortage of men, and continuing heavy bombardments. The surprise attack through the pipe was the last thing that irreversibly tipped the scales in favor of the Russians and diverted the last Ukrainian reserves in the area. On February 2nd, attackers pushed further from the north, starting to drive an alarming wedge between the city and Avdiivka coke and chemical plant. Ukrainians who already ran out of reserves are quickly routed from the many positions, as the offensive has a snowball effect. By February 8th, Russians capture a substantial portion of the city, continue determined attacks with the dual goal of further separating the factory plant and the city, as well as cutting Avdiivka's main supply line. Overall, the situation looks like one of the worst battlefield disasters Ukraine has faced since the first months of the war. Just in a week, Avdiivka, with its huge number of buildings and remnants of the formidable fortifications destroyed by bombs and artillery, turned from a firmly controlled city into a series of pockets with Ukrainian troops inside. Moreover, right when the battle entered its most critical phase, the key changes were made in Ukrainian military leadership. On February 8th, the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, Colonel General Alexander Sersky, replaces General Valery Zaluzhny on the post of the commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Facing the challenge of saving the situation in Avdiivka, Sersky decides to quickly deploy the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade, one of the most numerous, experienced, and battle-hardened units, right in the middle of the perfect storm, to buy time and prevent the encirclement. Meanwhile, by February 10th, Russians cross the railroad in Avdiivka as Ukrainians continue to fall back. The wedge near Tsarska Ochota also expands as Ukrainian troops start to retreat to avoid encirclement. Meanwhile, catastrophe also engulfs another fortified position called Zenit, based on the old air defense base. Russians no longer restricted by Ukrainian artillery that practically sits without the shells, and infantry that constantly falls back, advance from open and start closing the tight pocket. By February 13th, 3rd Assault Brigade arrives in full force and swiftly takes positions of the exhausted 116th Mechanized in Avdiivka coke and chemical plant. After arrival, the brigade acts according to its name, organizing tactical assaults first and foremost in a 2-kilometer wide corridor through which the 110th and other forces have to retreat in their struggle for survival. And this is how one of the most complicated Ukrainian operations begins. While the 3rd Assault Brigade acts as gatekeepers, engaging Russians in brutal combat and breaking their momentum, parts of the 110th Brigade and other units one by one start covertly moving towards the corridor. In order to pull the troops out of the Donetsk filtering station, one of the farthest strong points still held by Ukrainians, it's necessary to maintain control over Zenit and Chaburashka positions, which are almost completely encircled at this point. Against all the odds, Ukrainians there continue to hold the ground, so massive withdrawal begins in a rushed but still covered manner. Russians fail to notice the Ukrainian retreat from the eastern part of the city in time, so the chance to rout the enemy or close the pocket there slips away. However, defenders are not yet done, as the second part of the operation is even harder. Between February 14th and 15th, under the cover of the night, Ukrainians retreat from Zenit in small groups along the only available road. Soldiers of the 2nd Company, 1st Battalion of the 110th Motorized Brigade, under artillery strikes and engaging in skirmishes with Russian forces on the flanks, further take heavy losses, with some wounded soldiers coming back to the strong point. In the second attempt, Ukrainians outside of the pocket tried to get trapped soldiers out with armored vehicles, but the road was just too dangerous as Russians essentially closed the pocket by the end of the February 15th. Some soldiers slip away, while 6 wounded Ukrainians were left on Zenit, and Ukrainian command, through international organizations, negotiate their evacuation and exchange for Russian prisoners of war. Soon, a video surfaces where the Russians executed all 6 wounded, even though nothing in the video suggests that they resisted to the capture. On February 16th, attackers throw all their forces into the wedges in Ukrainian defense to capitalize on breakthroughs, as they already clearly see that Ukrainian forces slip away while being neither encircled nor routed. Racing with Russians, who push with their troops up to Lastochkine, border guards, police, and 110th Mechanized Brigade under cover of the 3rd Assault regroup to the area of the 9th District and then retreat through open fields to the east with all their vehicles. Even though Russians try to prevent the escape with artillery, they had to split the attention between the retreating 110th and attacking 3rd Assault Brigade. The latter, in a number of brutal attacks, annihilates in constant close quarters assaults the Russian 74th and 114th Brigades. Both allegedly take casualties numbering thousands of men and are rendered combat ineffective. Ukrainians also redeploy the 225th Separate Assault Battalion here, more artillery with their last shells, and most importantly a significant number of precious air defenses. On February 17th, a Russian Su-35S is shot down behind the front line, and the pilot is evacuated after successful ejection. Ukrainians also claim 2 Su-34s, which are primary carriers of ONPK bombs, but there is no evidence of these kills. However, it's likely true as no photos of destroyed columns or any similar indication of heavy airstrikes amid further Ukrainian retreat exists. On February 17th, Alexander Syrsky officially announces that Ukrainian forces retreat from Avdiivka. Russians also concentrated significant forces in the area of Avdiivka coke and chemical plant, which is captured by February 18th. Since the area was one of the most reinforced, we can assume with some degree of certainty that Ukrainians intentionally let Russians enter it. This way, significant forces were pulled away from the corridor area. In any case, the loss of the factory plant left Ukrainians no choice but to retreat to the new and weaker defensive line of Bardyche, Orlivka, and Tonenka, finishing an extremely complex withdrawal operation. After the retreat, while speculations started spreading about thousands of Ukrainian troops captured in Avdiivka, soon, however, these claims will be debunked not only by Ukrainian officials who claim that during the multiple days of retreat operation, around 100 Ukrainian soldiers were captured by Russians, but also by Andrei Mordvichov, who said that a total of around 300 Ukrainian troops surrendered. The average of these two numbers is likely closer to the truth, especially as there is no evidence of hundreds, not even thousands, of Ukrainian POWs. This indicates that the overall extraction of forces was more or less successful. Some Russian sources have reached similar conclusions, with prominent Russian mill blogger Andrei Morozov describing the situation as rather dire. In his opinion, Alexander Syrsky has managed to skillfully pull out of the encirclement all Ukrainian forces that Russians wanted to cut out and destroy. Furthermore, he declares that since October, Russian official losses only in Avdiivka surpassed 16,000 men and many more as wounded. He also makes a guess that Ukrainians lost between 5 and 7,000, while mentioning that Russians lost around 300 vehicles. This is an extremely optimistic number, as visually confirmed losses of Russians in all kinds of military equipment as of February 23, 2024, are at least 690 pieces. For the same time period, in Avdiivka, Ukrainians lost just 75 vehicles, which gives an incredible 9-to-1 loss ratio. Take the above-mentioned information with a pinch of salt, but the fact that Andrei Morozov had to delete the message under the pressure and afterward took his life might hint at least some level of credibility of his claims, especially as the number published are roughly consistent with the Ukrainian estimate that Russians lost 17,000 as killed and 30,000 as wounded in the battle. Comparing these losses with ones in Bakhmut, where attackers lost around 20,000 as killed, we can conclude that Avdiivka, being a less bloody battle overall, often hosted even more brutal combat. This is because 20,000 killed Wagner troops were the result of a 7 to 10 months long campaign, while the remarkable 16,000 Russian troops were lost in Avdiivka only in the course of 4 months of active assaults. In conclusion, the Battle of Avdiivka showed that even though trench warfare remains the main way of fighting as the second year of the war in Ukraine comes to an end, there is still constant evolution on the battlefield. Both sides found ways to overcome their own weaknesses, with Ukraine heavily relying on FPV drones instead of the scarce artillery shells, and Russia relying on OMPK glide bombs to tear through the concrete cities of Donbas. Even though Avdiivka is a triumph of this new Russian wonder weapon, it failed to save thousands of Russian soldiers from death in heavy urban assaults and poorly organized mechanized attacks. Moreover, similar to Severodonetsk and Bakhmut, Russians had to first annihilate the city before capturing nothing but smoldering ruins. Even though Ukrainians retreated from the town in a more or less organized manner, the continued heavy bombardments and delays with vital US aid up to late April 2024 created conditions in which Russians were able to continue the incremental advance. These made the loss of Avdiivka not merely a tactical or operational defeat, as it was in the cases of Severodonetsk and Bakhmut, but to a much greater degree strategic kind of loss, with significant negative consequences for Ukrainians in the long run. The Battle of Avdiivka also shows that the Russian military is no longer hampered by levels of losses close to Bakhmut, and firmly maintains the initiative after the Ukrainian 2023 summer counteroffensive. Their breakthrough towards Solcheretine was further steady grinded towards Pokrovsk. Deserves a separate video, but it became possible only because Avdiivka fell under Russian strikes when Ukraine was at its lowest. Underscoring the importance of the foreign military aid, however, should always go hand in hand with the fact that Ukrainians can lose more ground and men without it, but will not cease to resist, and the Battle of Avdiivka is the best proof of it.